The groundskeeper's rake caught on something small and white beneath the rotting maple leaves. October 26th, 2011, and Stanley Park's maintenance crews were clearing the walking paths before winter set in. Thomas Chen had worked these same trails for 15 years, collected every manner of debris from broken bottles to lost jewelry. But when he brushed away the decomposed foliage near Beaver Lake, his tool scraped against bone. Two small skulls, each no larger than his fist, lay nestled together in the dark earth. Rusted hairpins still clung to what remained of the temporal bones. Delicate metal flowers that hadn't seen daylight since 1936. The Vancouver police cordoned off the area within hours, but Thomas couldn't stop thinking about the way the skulls had been positioned. Not scattered by animals or erosion, but placed deliberately side by side, as if someone had tucked two children into bed for a sleep that lasted 75 years. The city would call it closure. Others would call it something else entirely. Fog rolled off English Bay that September morning, thick as wool blankets thrown across Stanley Park's 1,000 acres of cedar and Douglas fir. The scent of salt and wet earth hung heavy in the air, while somewhere in the distance, a foghorn called ships safely home to Cole Harbor. 8-year-old Margaret Liu walked hand in hand with her 6-year-old sister Dorothy along the path toward Beaver Lake, their mother's wicker basket swinging between them. The girls had been picking wildflowers since dawn, asters and goldenrod for their mother's shop on Pender Street, where she arranged bouquets for Vancouver's growing Chinese community. Margaret wore a blue cotton dress with pearl buttons, her black hair held back by silver hairpins their grandmother had brought from Canton. Dorothy favored yellow, bright as the late-blooming sunflowers they'd found growing wild near the park's eastern edge. Their father, Henry Liu, operated a small import business from a narrow building in Chinatown, just 3 blocks from where anti-Asian riots had torn through the streets 29 years earlier. The family kept a careful balance, visible enough to earn a living, invisible enough to avoid trouble. The girls spoke English at school and Cantonese at home, collected flowers in Stanley Park each weekend, and attended United Church services where their mother played piano for the predominantly white congregation. September 14th, 1936. Police Incident Report number 479. 2 Oriental children reported missing from Stanley Park vicinity. Last seen approximately 9:15 a.m. near Beaver Lake Trail. Margaret had promised their mother they'd return by noon with enough flowers to fill 12 arrangements for the weekend wedding trade. The autumn blooms wouldn't last much longer, and every stem counted toward the rent money that kept their Chinatown storefront alive. But as the morning fog grew thicker, the familiar paths began to look strange, and the girls found themselves walking deeper into the park's interior than they'd ever ventured before. What they discovered there would ensure they never made it home for lunch. Henry Liu appeared at the Vancouver Police Department's main desk at 2:47 p.m., his usually immaculate shirt wrinkled from running through the park's muddy trails. Sergeant William Morrison, a 20-year veteran who'd worked everything from dockside brawls to society murders, looked up from his paperwork with the weary expression of a man who'd heard every possible excuse for tardiness. "My daughters?" Henry said in careful English, each word measured to avoid the accent that might make Morrison dismiss him entirely. "They went to pick flowers this morning. They have not returned." Morrison's pen stayed poised above his incident log. In his experience, Chinese families kept tight control over their children, tighter than most white families, certainly. For a father to report his daughters missing meant something genuinely alarming had occurred. The search began at 4 p.m. with 6 constables and a dozen civilian volunteers. mostly neighbors from Chinatown, who closed their shops early to help comb Stanley Park's western sections. They called the girls' names in English and Cantonese, their voices echoing off the towering cedars as darkness crept across the water. Flashlight beams swept through salmonberry thickets and devil's club groves, illuminating every shadow where two small children might have taken shelter. By midnight, they'd covered nearly 300 acres. Sergeant Morrison's report, filed at 11:59 p.m., noted that the search had yielded no trace of the missing juveniles, no disturbed earth, no articles of clothing, no indication of struggle or foul play. What Morrison didn't include in his official documentation was the conversation he'd had with Parks Commissioner James Patterson around 10 p.m., when Patterson quietly suggested that perhaps the Chinese community should handle their own missing persons cases. After all, Morrison had duties to Vancouver's tax-paying citizens, and the city's resources couldn't be indefinitely devoted to every Oriental family that couldn't keep track of their children. Morrison agreed. The search was officially suspended at dawn on September 15th. The Liu family's flower shop remained closed for 3 days. Neighbors brought rice and vegetables, but Henry and his wife Li Mei sat motionless in their small apartment above the store, waiting for news that never came. Li Mei had stopped speaking entirely. Her voice simply disappeared, as if silence might somehow call her daughters back from whatever darkness had claimed them. On September 18th, Henry returned to the police station with a proposal. He would pay for a private search party, hire professional trackers, even bring in dogs from Seattle if necessary. All he needed was permission to organize a systematic sweep of Stanley Park's more remote areas, the dense undergrowth where official search teams hadn't penetrated. Sergeant Morrison listened politely, then explained the situation with bureaucratic precision. The park was city property, and liability concerns prevented unauthorized search operations. If Henry wanted to look for his daughters, he could walk the public trails like any other citizen. But organized searches required official sanction, and that sanction had been withdrawn. What Morrison didn't mention was the conversation he'd had that morning with Mayor Gerald McGeer, who'd made it clear that Vancouver's reputation as a destination for wealthy tourists couldn't be damaged by prolonged publicity about missing children. The story had already appeared in the Vancouver Daily Province, a brief item on page 6, but further coverage would only draw unwanted attention to the city's growing Oriental problem. Better to let the matter fade quietly from public memory. Henry Liu walked home through Chinatown's narrow streets, past shops where his neighbors pretended not to see him. Everyone knew about the missing girls, but acknowledgement carried risks. The Chinese Exclusion Act meant that any attention from authorities could result in deportation proceedings, business license revocations, or worse. Survival required invisibility, and missing children drew exactly the wrong kind of visibility. That night, Li Mei spoke her first words in 4 days. "They're still in the park," she whispered to Henry in Cantonese. "I can feel them calling." She would never stop believing that. Thomas McKinnon had worked Stanley Park's maintenance crews for 37 years when Margaret and Dorothy Liu disappeared. He knew every trail, every seasonal flooding pattern, every grove where teenagers went to drink stolen beer and carve their initials into cedar bark. Most importantly, he knew which areas the public never saw. The dense underbrush where fallen trees created natural shelters. The hidden clearings where the city dumped brush too far from public eyes to cause complaints. 3 days after the official search ended, McKinnon found something that made his blood freeze. Near the base of a massive Douglas fir, perhaps 200 yards from Beaver Lake's northern shore, someone had recently disturbed the earth. The depression was small, maybe 4 feet long and 2 feet wide, covered with freshly broken cedar boughs, arranged in a pattern too deliberate to be natural. McKinnon stood there for nearly an hour, his maintenance tools forgotten, trying to decide what he owed to 2 missing Chinese girls versus what he owed to his own survival. He'd worked for the Parks Department since 1899, saved every penny toward a small house in Burnaby, where he planned to retire with his wife Agnes. Getting involved in a police investigation, especially one the city clearly wanted to forget, could cost him everything. That evening, McKinnon stopped by the Marine Building downtown, where his supervisor James Patterson maintained his office. Patterson listened to McKinnon's discovery without taking notes, occasionally nodding as if confirming details he already knew. "Sometimes animals dig burrows," Patterson said finally. "Sometimes wind brings down branches in patterns that look deliberate to folks who aren't trained in forestry. Best to let nature handle its own business, don't you think?" September 21st, 1936. Parks Department Maintenance Log. T. McKinnon reports suspicious ground disturbance near Beaver Lake. Area investigated and found to contain natural animal den. No further action required. McKinnon signed the log entry himself. Agnes needed her medicine, and medicines cost money, and money required keeping his job. When he returned to the site 3 days later, fresh sawdust covered the disturbed earth, and a new trail marker had been installed 20 feet away to redirect foot traffic around the area entirely. The spot would remain undisturbed for 75 years. Liu began visiting Stanley Park every morning at dawn, walking the same route her daughters had taken on September 14th. She carried their empty flower basket and wore Margaret's spare sweater, hoping familiar scents might somehow guide the girls home. Other parents might have given up after weeks of fruitless searching, but Li Mei possessed the terrible patience of women who'd lost everything before and survived anyway. She'd come to Vancouver in 1923, one of the few Chinese women permitted entry under immigration laws designed to prevent families from establishing permanent roots in Canada. Her marriage to Henry had been arranged through letters, her entire life reduced to a single photograph and 3 sentences describing her ability to cook, clean, and bear children. When Margaret was born, Li Mei had whispered Cantonese lullabies about mountain flowers and flowing streams, teaching her daughters to find beauty in a world that considered them expendable. Other park visitors learned to avoid the small Chinese woman who appeared each morning with her wicker basket, searching the undergrowth for children who were obviously never coming home. Some felt pity, others annoyance, but most felt nothing at all. Missing Chinese children weren't their responsibility, and Li Mei's silent vigil served as an uncomfortable reminder of tragedies they preferred not to acknowledge. October 7th, 1936, Vancouver Daily Province, page 11. Police remind citizens that Stanley Park remains safe for family recreation. Recent rumors of dangerous conditions are unfounded and harmful to Vancouver's tourism industry. The article made no mention of the Liu family or their missing daughters. By October, the girls had simply vanished from public consciousness, erased as efficiently as if they'd never existed. But Li Mei continued her mourning. Walks, and sometimes other Chinese families would glimpse her through the cedars, a ghost haunting the scene of her own devastation. Park groundskeepers began timing their work to avoid the areas where Li Mei searched most intensively, not from compassion, but from simple discomfort. Her presence reminded them of things they'd been ordered to forget, of small depressions in the earth that had been covered with sawdust and deliberately forgotten. What would you do, watching a mother search endlessly for children you knew would never be found? Henry Liu's import business collapsed within 6 months of his daughter's disappearance. Not from grief alone, though grief certainly played its part, but from the systematic withdrawal of white customers who found his tragedy inconvenient. Ordering silk and porcelain from a man whose children had vanished carried uncomfortable implications about the safety of Vancouver's Chinese community, and uncomfortable implications were bad for business. His warehouse on Powell Street, once filled with ceramic vases and embroidered textiles, stood nearly empty by March 1937. The few remaining customers paid late and negotiated aggressively, knowing Henry had little leverage to demand better terms. Desperation made men vulnerable, and vulnerable men accepted whatever scraps were offered. Henry had always understood his place in Vancouver's economic ecosystem, useful enough to tolerate, successful enough to tax, foreign enough to sacrifice when sacrifice became necessary. Chinese businessmen succeeded by making themselves indispensable to white merchants who needed access to Asian markets. But indispensability was always conditional. Missing children raised questions about community safety, and questions about safety made white customers nervous. By summer 1937, Henry was working 16-hour days in a salmon cannery on the Fraser River, his hands bleeding from processing fish alongside recent immigrants who spoke no English. The man who'd once employed 12 workers and maintained credit accounts with half of Chinatown's businesses now earned 60 cents per day gutting fish that would be shipped to restaurants he could no longer afford to enter. Li Mei continued her morning searches, but now she walked to Stanley Park before dawn and returned after dark to avoid being seen by former customers who might recognize her deteriorating clothes and haunted expression. The flower shop had been sold to pay their debts, its cheerful displays of asters and roses replaced by a barber shop that served only Chinese clients. March 15, 1937, British Columbia Department of Immigration. Henry Liu's business license suspended for failure to maintain required insurance coverage. The bureaucratic language concealed a simpler truth. Families whose children disappeared couldn't be trusted to maintain the careful invisibility that made Chinese businesses acceptable to white. Vancouver. Henry's tragedy had made him visible, and visibility was dangerous for everyone in his community. Better to let him fade quietly into the canneries, where forgotten men processed forgotten fish for tables that would never welcome them as guests. James Wong operated a small photography studio on Pender Street, 3 doors down from where the Liu family's flower shop had once brightened Chinatown's narrow sidewalks. He specialized in portraits for families sending photographs back to relatives in China. Formal images that proved Canadian life was prosperous enough to justify the dangerous journey across the Pacific. Wong had photographed Margaret and Dorothy Liu in August 1936, just 3 weeks before they disappeared. The girls wore matching white dresses with lace collars, their hair carefully arranged with the silver pins their grandmother had brought from Canton. Margaret held a small bouquet of late summer flowers, while Dorothy smiled shyly at the camera, one hand reaching toward her sister's arm. The photograph remained in Wong's studio window for months after the girls vanished, a haunting reminder that beauty could disappear without warning. Other families began requesting that he remove the image. Their children found it disturbing, and disturbing photographs were bad for business. But Wong refused, claiming the girls deserved to be remembered, even if the police had forgotten them. In December 1936, Wong received an unexpected visitor. Parks Commissioner James Patterson arrived at the studio alone, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the expression of a man conducting distasteful but necessary business. "The photograph in your window," Patterson said without preamble. "It's causing concern among some of our citizens. Reminders of unresolved tragedies can be harmful to community morale. Wong studied Patterson's face, reading the threat beneath the polite language. "The girls were my neighbors," he replied carefully. "Removing their photograph feels like killing them twice." Patterson opened his portfolio and withdrew a business license renewal form, already partially completed with Wong's information. "Photography is a privilege, not a right," he said quietly. "Privileges can be revoked when they conflict with public interest." January 2nd, 1937, City of Vancouver Business Records. James Wong Photography Studio. License renewed subject to compliance with community standards regarding public displays. Wong removed the photograph that afternoon, but he never destroyed it. Instead, he filed it carefully in his studio's archive, along with hundreds of other portraits documenting lives the city preferred to forget. The image would remain there for decades, a single piece of evidence that Margaret and Dorothy Liu had existed, had smiled, had mattered to someone. The empty window space was filled with a cheerful display advertising wedding photography for the spring social season. Constable Robert Hayes had been part of the original search team that combed Stanley Park during those fog-shrouded days in September 1936. Unlike his colleagues, who'd approached the assignment as routine duty, Hayes had two daughters of his own, Mary, aged 7, and Susan, aged 5, who reminded him uncomfortably of the missing Liu girls. Hayes had been the officer who'd taken Henry Liu's initial missing persons report, had seen the genuine terror in the father's eyes when he described his daughter's failure to return home. Most missing children were runaways or custody disputes, cases that resolved themselves within hours or days. But the Liu girls were different, too young to run away, too closely supervised to simply wander off, too loved by their parents to disappear without causing immediate alarm. 3 months after the search was suspended, Hayes began conducting his own unofficial investigation during off-duty hours. He walked the park's remoter trails, interviewed gardeners and maintenance workers, searched for any evidence the official teams might have overlooked. His sergeant had made it clear that pursuing the case could damage his career prospects, but Hayes couldn't stop thinking about his own daughters and how he'd want someone to keep searching if they vanished. February 9th, 1937, Personal Journal of Robert Hayes. Spoke with groundskeeper T. McKinnon about suspicious earth disturbance near Beaver Lake. McKinnon claims area was animal den, but his manner suggests otherwise. Something happened there. Something we were told not to find. Hayes never filed an official report about his conversation with McKinnon, but he began documenting his observations in a private journal that he kept locked in his home desk. The entries were brief, factual, written in the careful language of a police officer who understood that some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud. In March 1937, Hayes was quietly transferred to traffic duty in Vancouver's eastern suburbs, far from Stanley Park and far from any ongoing investigations. His replacement was told that the Liu case had been closed due to lack of evidence, and that further inquiries would be considered insubordination. Hayes spent the next 28 years directing traffic and issuing parking citations, but he never stopped believing that Margaret and Dorothy Liu were still in Stanley Park, waiting for someone brave enough to find them. When he retired in 1965, his final act was to place his private journal in a safety deposit box, with instructions that it should be opened only if the missing girls were ever discovered. Children don't just disappear. By 1940, the Liu family's tragedy had achieved the perfect bureaucratic outcome: complete erasure from official memory. Police files had been archived in basement storage rooms, where they gathered dust alongside thousands of other resolved cases. Newspaper morgues contained brief clippings that mentioned missing children, but provided no names, no details, no reminders that two little girls had once picked flowers in Stanley Park and never returned home. The war provided convenient distraction from uncomfortable questions about municipal competence. Hitler's advance across Europe dominated headlines, while Japanese submarines lurked off British Columbia's coast, threatening Vancouver's strategic position as a Pacific naval base. Missing Chinese children seemed trivial compared to global catastrophe, and trivial matters could be safely forgotten. Henry Liu had disappeared entirely from Chinatown's commercial district, swallowed by the Fraser River's industrial canneries, where immigrant workers processed fish without surnames or stories that required official acknowledgement. Li Mei had stopped her morning vigils in Stanley Park, not from acceptance but from exhaustion, 70 pounds lighter than before. Her daughters vanished, her hair gone completely gray, her voice reduced to whispers even close friends could barely hear. December 7th, 1941. Vancouver Police Department budget meeting. Resources previously allocated to missing persons investigations will be redirected toward wartime security measures. Cold cases lacking active leads will remain suspended indefinitely. The motion passed unanimously. Sergeant Morrison, now promoted to lieutenant, didn't mention the Liu case specifically, but everyone understood which investigations would be permanently shelved. Wartime demanded focus on present dangers, not ancient mysteries that had already been adequately investigated and found lacking in evidence. Stanley Park itself was transformed into a defensive position, with observation posts hidden among the cedars and anti-aircraft batteries concealed beneath camouflage netting. Soldiers patrolled the same trails where Li Mei had once searched for her daughters, their boots passing directly over the sawdust-covered depression that groundskeeper McKinnon had marked and forgotten. The park had become a fortress, and fortresses kept secrets buried deep. Thomas McKinnon carried his secret for 43 years before the weight became unbearable. In 1979, diagnosed with lung cancer and given 6 months to live, he summoned his grandson William to his hospital bed at Vancouver General and handed him a sealed envelope that had been locked in McKinnon's basement safe since the winter of 1936. "There's something I need you to know about those Chinese girls who went missing in the park," McKinnon said, his voice barely audible above the oxygen machine's mechanical breathing. "Something I should have done differently." The envelope contained a hand-drawn map of Stanley Park's northwestern section, with careful notations marking the location where McKinnon had discovered disturbed earth 3 days after the girls disappeared. His notes described the positioning of cedar boughs, the dimensions of the excavated area, the fresh sawdust that Parks Commissioner Patterson had ordered spread across the site to prevent public alarm. William McKinnon read his grandfather's confession twice before understanding its implications. The old man had found evidence of the girl's burial site, but had chosen employment security over justice, cover-up over courage. 2 children had been sacrificed to preserve one groundskeeper's pension, and the secret had eaten him alive for 4 decades. "What do you want me to do with this?" William asked. McKinnon closed his eyes. "Whatever you can live with," he whispered. "I couldn't live with speaking up. Maybe you can live with staying quiet." Thomas McKinnon died 6 weeks later without ever revealing his secret to authorities. William kept the envelope for 32 years, opening it occasionally to reread his grandfather's careful notes about measurements and locations, coordinates that could lead someone to exactly the right spot beneath the Douglas firs, if they knew where to look. In 2011, when news broke that 2 small skulls had been discovered in Stanley Park, William recognized the location immediately. His grandfather's map was accurate to within 10 feet of where the groundskeeper's rake had finally uncovered what Thomas McKinnon had known was there all along. The confession provided answers to questions no one had bothered asking for 75 years. Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic anthropologist at the University of British Columbia, received the call about the Stanley Park discovery at 9:43 a.m. on October 27, 2011. Vancouver police needed an expert to examine what appeared to be historical remains, possibly connected to missing persons cases from the early 20th century. Chen arrived at the excavation site to find two small skulls positioned side by side in a shallow depression, surrounded by fragments of rotted fabric and the corroded remains of metal hairpins. The bones showed no evidence of trauma or violence. Death had come from exposure, starvation, or medical emergency rather than assault. More disturbing was the deliberate arrangement of the remains, suggesting someone had buried the children with care rather than simply disposing of bodies. The hairpins provided the crucial evidence. Made of silver and shaped like delicate flowers, they matched exactly the style worn in formal photographs by Chinese girls during the 1930s. More specifically, they matched the description Li Mei Liu had given to police when reporting her daughter's disappearance. Silver pins their grandmother had brought from Canton, decorated with plum blossoms and lotus flowers. Carbon dating confirmed the remains were approximately 75 years old, perfectly consistent with the 1936 disappearance. DNA analysis would require tissue samples that no longer existed, but dental records from the Chinese community's medical clinic provided additional verification. Margaret Liu had a distinctive chip in her left front tooth, caused by falling on Pender Street's brick sidewalks 3 months before she vanished. The skull Chen identified as belonging to the older child showed identical dental evidence. November 14, 2011, Forensic Examination Report, Case Number VPD 2011-4471. Remains consistent with missing persons Margaret and Dorothy Liu, disappeared September 14, 1936. Cause of death undetermined due to skeletal preservation. Evidence suggests intentional burial. Chen's report raised more questions than it answered. Who had found the girls after they died? Who had cared enough to bury them properly instead of leaving their bodies to scavengers? And why had the burial site remained undiscovered for 3/4 of a century, despite multiple police searches and decades of park maintenance? The answer lay in William McKinnon's grandfather's confession, still sealed in an envelope that wouldn't be opened for another 6 months. Detective Inspector Michael Torres had investigated dozens of historical cold cases during his 20-year career with Vancouver police. But the Stanley Park discovery presented unusual complications. The original investigation files had been destroyed in a basement flood during the 1960s, leaving only newspaper clippings and fragmentary evidence to reconstruct what had happened in 1936. Torres began interviewing elderly residents who might remember the Liu family's disappearance, but most of Vancouver's Chinese community had been scattered by the 1940s federal relocation policies. The few remaining witnesses spoke carefully, their testimonies filtered through decades of experience with police investigations that rarely prioritized Chinese victims. One breakthrough came from James Wong's photography studio archives, discovered in a basement storage room after Wong's death in 2008. Among hundreds of formal portraits were 3 photographs of the Liu family, 2 showing Margaret and Dorothy in matching dresses, 1 showing the entire family posed outside their Pender Street flower shop. The photographs provided crucial evidence about the girls' appearances and clothing, but they also revealed something more troubling. In the family portrait, Henry Liu's expression carried the wariness of a man who understood his place in Vancouver's racial hierarchy. while Li Mei's eyes showed the terrible vulnerability of a woman protecting children in a society that considered them expendable. February 6, 2012, Detective Inspector Torres's case notes. Pattern suggests systematic official negligence rather than criminal conspiracy. City authorities prioritized tourism concerns over missing children investigation. Standard procedure for Chinese families during exclusion era. Torres had uncovered a truth that couldn't be prosecuted because all the responsible officials were dead, and institutional racism wasn't a crime under Canadian law during the 1930s. The girls had been failed not by individual malice, but by systemic indifference, which was somehow worse because it was so completely legal. The investigation stalled until William McKinnon walked into Vancouver Police Headquarters in March 2012, carrying his grandfather's 43-year-old confession and a map that explained exactly how 2 children had been found, buried, and forgotten by the very people paid to protect them. Truth had its own terrible patience. Mayor Gregor Robertson's office issued a statement on May 15, 2012, acknowledging that the Stanley Park remains had been positively identified as Margaret and Dorothy Liu, missing since September 1936. The city expressed deep regret for the inadequate investigation that failed these children and their family, while stopping just short of accepting legal responsibility for police incompetence or official cover-up. The statement made no mention of Parks Commissioner Patterson's role in concealing evidence, Sergeant Morrison's premature termination of the search, or the systematic bureaucratic erasure that had removed the Liu family from Vancouver's official memory. Dead officials couldn't be prosecuted, and institutional failures from 7 decades past fell outside any statute of limitations. Henry Liu had died in 1968, still working at the Fraser River canneries, never knowing his daughters had been found and buried within hours of their disappearance. Li Mei had survived until 1983, spending her final years in a Chinatown boarding house where she continued whispering their names in Cantonese until her voice finally failed completely. No relatives remained to claim the girls' remains or demand accountability for the decades of official indifference. Margaret and Dorothy Liu had become archaeological specimens rather than victims of criminal negligence, their bones cataloged and stored in university research facilities alongside thousands of other anonymous remains from Vancouver's buried past. The Chinese Cultural Center organized a memorial service in June 2012, attended by 47 people who had never known the girls, but understood the larger story their deaths represented. 2 small white coffins were buried in Mountain View Cemetery, their headstones engraved with the same silver flowers that had decorated their hairpins. June 9, 2012, Vancouver Sun editorial. The Liu case reminds us that justice delayed is not always justice denied, but sometimes justice forgotten entirely. We owe these children more than belated acknowledgement. But acknowledgement without consequences wasn't justice. It was simply another form of official amnesia, dressed in ceremonial language that absolved the living of responsibility for the sins of their predecessors. The girls were buried again, this time with witnesses, but the system that had killed them through indifference remained unchanged. Stanley Park returned to normal within weeks of the memorial service, its trails crowded with joggers and tourists who had already forgotten about 2 Chinese girls who died picking flowers where families now posed for vacation photographs. The excavation site near Beaver Lake was restored with fresh soil and native plantings, marked only by a small bronze plaque that most visitors walked past without reading. Thomas Chen, the groundskeeper who discovered the skulls, requested a transfer to Vancouver's Eastern Park system, unable to work trails where children's voices seemed to echo through morning fog. His replacement, A recent immigrant from Guangzhou noticed that the ravens gathered differently near Beaver Lake, as if something beneath the earth still commanded their attention. Detective Inspector Torres closed the Liu investigation with mixed satisfaction. He'd identified the victims and documented the systematic failures that had erased them from official memory. But justice remained elusive when all the responsible parties were decades dead. Police training protocols were updated to prevent similar oversights, though Torres suspected institutional racism would simply evolve rather than disappear. The most haunting discovery came in Torres's final review of the case files. Hidden in William McKinnon's grandfather's confession was a detail that had escaped initial analysis. Fresh sawdust hadn't been the only material spread across the burial site in 1936. Parks Department records showed that lime had also been applied to accelerate natural decomposition and prevent disease. Someone in authority had known exactly what was buried there and had taken deliberate steps to ensure it would never be found. September 14, 2012, 76 years after Margaret and Dorothy Liu disappeared. Vancouver's Chinese community held a quiet ceremony at Beaver Lake, releasing paper flowers into the water while children's voices sang lullabies in Cantonese and English. The fog rolled in from English Bay as it always did, carrying salt and memories in equal measure. Li Mei Liu's voice seemed to whisper among the cedars, finally answering the question she'd asked for 47 years. Her daughters had never left the park where they'd gone to pick flowers for their mother's shop, where they'd trusted that beauty and innocence would be enough to keep them safe. Vancouver's tourism industry markets Stanley Park as one of the world's most beautiful urban wilderness areas, its 1,000 acres of temperate rainforest providing escape from the city's steel and concrete. Visitors photograph Siwash Rock and the totem poles, jog the seawall path, and picnic in meadows where bears once roamed and children once disappeared without leaving any trace except the bones they'd become. The bronze plaque near Beaver Lake reads simply, "In memory of Margaret and Dorothy Liu, who found peace in these woods, September 1936. Most joggers pass it without stopping, focused on fitness apps and morning schedules, unaware that they're running directly over Earth that once held terrible secrets. But sometimes, when the fog rolls in from English Bay and the park grows quiet between tourist seasons, groundskeepers and early morning walkers report hearing children's laughter echoing through the cedars. Not threatening or supernatural, but simply joyful, as if two little girls were still picking flowers somewhere just beyond the edge of sight. Park maintenance crews have learned to expect the sound during September mornings, when the light slants through the trees exactly as it did in 1936, and the living world remembers what official Vancouver chose to forget. Margaret and Dorothy Liu remain in Stanley Park forever, not as victims, but as children who trusted that flowers were worth picking, that beauty was worth preserving, that love was stronger than the indifference that had tried to erase them from history entirely. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.